5,000 years ago, at the edge of the known world, there was a land that should not have survived. A narrow ribbon of green trapped between endless desert and a violent sky. A civilization balanced on the behavior of a single river. To outsiders, these people were insignificant. Farmers, villagers, river dwellers clinging to fertile mud. They had no iron, no engines, no machines capable of reshaping the land, and yet everything they would become depended on a single decision. Because every year the river judged them. If the waters rose too little, the land starved. If they rose too much, villages vanished. Fields rotted, families disappeared, hunger followed, disorder followed. And when the river failed completely, death followed. Other peoples watched from a distance and saw weakness. A society one bad season away from collapse. A land ruled by chance, not power. No one feared them. No one respected them. No one imagined they were standing at the beginning of history's first engineered empire. But along the riverbanks, a realization took shape. They could not outrun the river. They could not pray it away. They could not survive by hope alone. They would have to confront it. The river did not care about ambition. It did not care about belief. It came when it wanted, and it destroyed without apology. Some years it arrived gently. The soil drank deeply. Crops flourished. Life felt secure. Other years the river became a weapon. It tore through fields, collapsed homes, turned harvests into rot. People learned to fear the sound of rising water. They learned to watch the clouds far to the south. They learned to count seasons, stars, and signs. Because too much water meant ruin. Too little meant starvation. There was no balance, only survival by chance. And chance is a fragile foundation for a civilization. As populations grew, the danger grew with them. More mouths to feed, more land to protect, more lives tied to an unpredictable force. This was the moment where most societies disappeared, where people scattered, where history erased names before they were ever written. But instead, something rare happened. They stayed. They organized. They began to observe. If the river could not be trusted, then the river had to be understood. Not worshipped, not feared. Understood. They watched how water moved, where it slowed, where it gathered, where it destroyed. They noticed patterns others ignored. They learned when to act and when to wait. Slowly, an impossible idea emerged. If the river could be guided, even slightly, it could change everything. To outsiders, the idea was laughable. Earth and stone against a force that shaped continents. No metal tools, no advanced science, just human labour. They began with small barriers, simple channels, crude embankments. Some worked, many failed. Walls collapsed. Water found weak points. Entire seasons of work vanished overnight. People died. Mistakes were not theoretical. They were fatal. But each failure revealed something new. How pressure behaved, where foundations held, where they broke. This was not engineering as the world would later define it. It was learning carved into the land through loss. And still, they continued, because every failure delivered something more valuable than success, knowledge. And knowledge does not wash away. Over time, their efforts grew bolder, barriers became larger, channels stretched farther. Communities worked together, not as tribes, but as a system. For the first time, the river began to hesitate. It still flooded, it still threatened, but it no longer ruled without resistance. Fields survived seasons that once meant famine. Cities stayed dry while chaos swallowed the countryside. And slowly, something changed. They stopped reacting to the river. They began anticipating it. The river, that once decided their fate, was becoming part of their design. What began as survival turned into control, and control turned into power. By the time neighbouring lands realised what was happening, it was already too late. This was no longer a fragile river culture. It was a society that could organize tens of thousands of people, move stone without machines, and reshape nature itself. They had not defeated the river. They had learned its language, and that knowledge would allow them to do something no civilization had done before. They would build not just to live, but to be remembered. And in doing so, they would change the meaning of power forever. The river still flooded. The river still threatened. But it no longer dictated everything. For the first time, human planning began to compete with nature. Fields that once vanished underwater now survived. Villages that once fled every summer remained in place. Food could be stored, populations could grow. And with growth came a new problem: organization. Thousands of people could not act independently anymore. Someone had to decide where to dig, where to build, where to reinforce. Leadership emerged not from tradition, but from necessity. Those who understood the river gained authority. Those who could organize labor gained power. What began as survival engineering quietly became political control. Because when you decide who eats, you decide who lives. Entire communities were now bound together by projects that took months, sometimes years. Canals stretched farther. Barriers grew thicker. Stone replaced earth where earth failed. The work was relentless. Men hauled, blocks with ropes and sleds. Feet bled on hot sand. Hands cracked and split. There were no machines to absorb effort. Every mistake cost lives. And yet people returned every season, because the alternative was worse. As knowledge accumulated, confidence followed. The builders learned how to angle walls, how to widen foundations, how to let water pass without destroying everything. They learned that resisting the river completely was impossible, but redirecting it was not. This shift in thinking changed everything. Instead of fighting nature head-on, they worked with it. They guided excess water into channels. They slowed its speed. They spread its force. Floods became predictable. Predictability became stability. And stability gave birth to something unprecedented. Cities, not temporary camps, not seasonal villages. Permanent centers of power. Places protected not by luck, but by design. As cities grew, they attracted more people. As populations increased, so did ambition. Once survival was secured, a new question emerged. What could be built now? The answer was not modest. They began to build for eternity. Stone replaced mud. Scale replaced simplicity. Structures rose not because they were needed, but because they could be made to rise. This was the moment where engineering crossed a threshold. No longer reactive, no longer defensive. Now it was expressive. It sent a message. This land was organized. This land was powerful. This land was permanent. The people who once feared the river now shaped landscapes. They carved hills. They leveled ground. And with each success, confidence grew. Perhaps too much, because success carries its own danger. The builders began to believe they had mastered more than water. They believed they had mastered nature itself. And that belief pushed them further. They attempted structures larger than anything attempted before. Heavier, taller, more complex. Stone on stone. Weight stacked upon weight. Some stood, others failed catastrophically. Walls cracked. Foundations shifted. Entire sections collapsed without warning. The ground itself betrayed them. These failures were not hidden. They were visible scars, monuments abandoned halfway through construction, ruins that told stories of ambition outrunning knowledge. But instead of retreating, they adapted. Failures were analyzed, angles were changed, techniques refined. Each disaster added to a growing body of practical science. They did not write equations, they built them. And slowly, painfully, precision emerged. Structures stopped collapsing. Stone learned to support stone. The impossible became repeatable. With mastery came something darker: control. The same systems that organized labor for construction now organized society itself. People were counted, assigned, moved, food distribution became centralized, work became mandatory. Power no longer flowed from tradition alone, it flowed from logistics. Those at the top commanded tens of thousands of workers, not because of fear alone, but because the system demanded coordination. This was the birth of bureaucracy. Records were kept, supplies tracked, labour scheduled, engineering had created administration, and administration created hierarchy. At the top stood rulers whose authority no longer depended solely on belief or force. It depended on infrastructure. They did not just rule people, they ruled systems. And systems endure longer than individuals. As generations passed, these rulers began to think differently about time. Survival had once meant the next harvest. Now it meant legacy. They wanted to be remembered, not for seasons, but for millennia. Architecture became a tool of immortality. Structures were designed not to serve the living, but to outlast them. The scale increased again. Projects spanned decades, sometimes longer than a single lifetime. This required faith in continuity, in succession. In the system itself, it worked until it didn't. Because complexity carries fragility. The more intricate the system became, the more it depended on balance, flood cycles, labour availability, political stability. A single disruption could ripple through everything. And disruptions came, climate shifted, floods weakened or vanished, harvests failed, the systems built to manage abundance struggled to adapt to scarcity. Food shortages returned, but now the population was larger, more dependent, less flexible. The structures that once guaranteed survival now demanded constant maintenance. Canals silted up, barriers weakened, neglect turned engineering marvels into liabilities. Power became brittle, leadership that once coordinated survival now demanded obedience. Revolts followed, fragmentation set in. What had been built over centuries could unravel in generations. Yet even as the system strained, its achievements remained undeniable. The knowledge accumulated through failure and persistence did not disappear. It waited for future rulers, future builders. The civilization had proven something irreversible, that humans, with enough organization, could reshape nature itself. Not perfectly, not permanently, but long enough to change history. And that lesson would echo far beyond this river, into every empire that followed, into every society that believed control was permanent. The river had been mastered, but mastery always comes at a cost, and the final price had yet to be paid. What followed was not collapse, not yet. First came escalation. The systems that had once protected survival were now pushed beyond necessity. They no longer existed to manage water or food alone. They existed to project certainty. Rulers began to demand permanence, not just stability, not just order, eternity. Stone was chosen not because it was practical, but because it refused to decay. Mud could be rebuilt. Stone declared permanence. Entire landscapes were reorganized to serve this idea. Quarries opened far from cities. Roads were cut across desert. Supply chains stretched farther than ever before. The logistics alone were staggering. Thousands of workers moved in waves. Stone was extracted, shaped, hauled, positioned. Every step required coordination. There was no room for improvisation anymore. Mistakes became unacceptable. This was engineering under pressure, and pressure reveals limits. Early attempts failed again. Structures leaned, chambers cracked, weight shifted in ways builders did not expect. Some monuments collapsed partially, others were abandoned entirely. But unlike earlier failures, these were no longer learning experiments. They were public embarrassments. Rulers could not accept imperfection. Failure threatened authority. So solutions became more aggressive. Foundations were widened, angles reduced, Redundancy increased. Margins of error shrank. The builders learned to distribute weight rather than stack it blindly. They learned to carve inward as much as upward. They learned to hollow stone without weakening it. These lessons did not come from theory. They came from watching entire projects fail, and then finally they succeeded. Structures stood, not for seasons, not for years, for generations. The moment that happened, something shifted permanently. Success validated everything: the labour, the cost, the deaths. The system worked. And because it worked, it demanded repetition. One monument was not enough. One success only encouraged greater ambition. Each ruler sought to exceed the last. Size increased. Complexity multiplied. Construction timelines stretched across decades. The living built for the dead. The present laboured for the future. Entire populations were redirected toward projects that produced no immediate benefit. Food was diverted, manpower concentrated. And yet, the system endured, because it had been optimised. Records tracked output, schedules regulated labour cycles, resource flows were monitored. This was no longer brute force, it was management. The same principles that guided water through channels now guided people through systems. Order replaced spontaneity. Efficiency replaced flexibility. And for a time, the results were extraordinary. The civilization reached heights no one else could match. Its cities were planned, its borders fortified, its infrastructure unmatched. Neighbours did not mock anymore. They feared. They traded. They paid tribute. They avoided confrontation. The message was unmistakable. This civilization did not rely on chance. It relied on structure, but structure carries a hidden weakness. It assumes continuity. It assumes conditions will remain within expected parameters, and nature does not make guarantees. Gradually, signs appeared. Flood cycles shifted. Some years the water came late. Other years it barely came at all. Canals dried, fields underperformed. At first, reserves compensated. That was what reserves were for. But the reserves had limits. Population levels were now higher than ever. Urban centres consumed more than they produced. The system that once thrived on predictability struggled with variation. Maintenance lagged. Canals silted. Barriers weakened. Engineering marvels required constant attention that depended on political stability. And stability began to fracture. As resources tightened, authority hardened, work quotas increased, punishments intensified. What had once been coordination became coercion. Resistance followed. Local leaders ignored central directives. Labour slowed. Projects stalled. The system, so efficient when conditions were ideal, became rigid under stress. Adaptation slowed. Where earlier generations experimented freely, now deviation was discouraged. Innovation gave way to preservation. The goal was no longer improvement. It was survival of the system itself. And that is when fragility became unavoidable. A series of poor flood years compounded existing strain. Food shortages returned, not gradually, but suddenly. Urban populations suffered first. Distribution networks failed. The same centralization that once ensured abundance now amplified scarcity. Revolts erupted in peripheral regions. Borders weakened. The authority that once commanded loyalty through results now demanded obedience through force. And force is expensive. Resources diverted to suppression could not be used for maintenance. Neglected infrastructure deteriorated further. The feedback loop accelerated. What had taken centuries to build began to unravel in decades. Yet even as power diminished, the structures remained. Stone does not collapse on schedule. Monuments still stood. Canals still scarred the land. They became reminders, not just of greatness, but of limitation. Future generations would inherit both. They would study the ruins, reuse techniques, adapt lessons. The knowledge embedded in stone and earth did not disappear. It waited for new contexts, new rulers, new ambitions. This civilization did not vanish. It transformed. Its dominance faded, but its influence spread. The principles it discovered, organization, logistics, systems thinking, became the foundation for every empire that followed. Others would learn the same lesson. Control creates power. Power invites ambition. Ambition strains systems. And systems, no matter how refined, remain vulnerable to forces beyond prediction. The river had been guided. Stone had been mastered. People had been organized. But permanence had proven elusive. And the final truth remained. Engineering can reshape the world, but it cannot freeze it. Long after the height of their power had passed, the structures remained. Stone does not recognize decline. It does not register political weakness. It simply endures. Generations were born into a landscape already shaped by minds long gone. Canals still traced the land. Foundations still anchored cities. Monuments still cast shadows across the desert. To those who lived among them, these structures felt eternal, unchanging, permanent. And that illusion mattered, because even when authority weakened, even when borders shrank, the physical presence of what had been built continued to project power. Rulers came and went. Dynasties rose and fell. But the system survived in fragments. New leaders inherited old infrastructure. They repaired what they could. They reused what they understood. Some tried to revive the old order. Others adapted it. But none could escape its influence. The knowledge embedded in stone did not require explanation. It taught by example how weight could be distributed, how space could be organized, how labor could be coordinated. Even failures became instruction. Collapsed structures revealed limits. Cracks showed where stress traveled. Abandoned projects warned against excess. Future builders learned not only what worked, but what broke. And that knowledge spread. Beyond the river, beyond the desert. Merchants carried stories. Travelers carried techniques. Conquerors carried blueprints. Other civilizations observed and adapted. They borrowed ideas. They modified systems. They applied lessons to their own landscapes. Some succeeded. Some failed. But none started from nothing. The legacy of this civilization was not dominance. It was precedent. It proved that complexity could be managed, that massive human effort could be coordinated, that nature could be influenced, if not controlled. That lesson reshaped the future. Empires would rise elsewhere, built on similar principles. Road networks, water systems, administrative hierarchies. Each believed itself unique. Each believed itself permanent. Each eventually learned the same truth. Control has limits. The people who first reshaped the river understood this instinctively. They adapted constantly. They experimented freely. Their strength lay not in perfection, but in responsiveness. It was only later, when systems hardened, that vulnerability increased. Flexibility gave way to rigidity. Learning gave way to repetition. And repetition cannot respond to change. That pattern would repeat again and again throughout history, in different lands, under different names, always with the same arc. Innovation born from necessity, success validated by results, ambition fueled by power, rigidity imposed by scale, then disruption. The river changed, the climate shifted, resources tightened, and systems that once thrived struggled to adapt. The difference was that this time the evidence remained visible. Unlike societies built from wood and earth, this one left stone behind, stone that still speaks, not through words, but through scale, through alignment, through endurance. It reminds us that human ambition is capable of extraordinary transformation, and equally capable of overreach. The structures that remain are not warnings, they are records. They show what humans can achieve when organisation, knowledge, and labour align. and they show the cost of believing that alignment can last forever. In the end, this civilization did not fail because it lacked intelligence. It failed because it succeeded too well. It built systems so effective that it trusted them completely. And complete trust leaves no room for uncertainty. The river still flows. It always has. It no longer fears barriers or channels built thousands of years ago. It simply moves around them. Nature waits longer than any civilization can endure. What remains is memory. Not written memory alone, but physical memory. Carved into landscapes, embedded in foundations. A reminder that the first great experiment in large-scale human organization changed the world permanently. Not because it lasted forever, but because it showed what was possible and what was not. In the end, there was no single moment when everything collapsed. No dramatic final flood. No sudden disappearance. What happened was slower, quieter, almost invisible at first. Maintenance was delayed. Repairs were postponed. Decisions were repeated instead of reconsidered. The systems kept working, just well enough to hide their decline. People adapted, as humans always do. They lowered expectations. They accepted shortages. They survived inside structures built for abundance. And that, more than any invasion or disaster, marked the end of the age. Because this civilization was not destroyed from the outside, it was outlived by the world it had shaped. The river continued to flow, the desert continued to advance, and time continued to move forward. Centuries passed. New rulers stood where old ones once commanded. New beliefs replaced old certainties. Languages changed. Names faded. But the land remembered. Stone remembers. Even when its builders are forgotten, stone keeps the record. It preserves the ambition, the precision, the audacity. It preserves the mistakes as well. Cracks left unrepaired. Foundations stretched beyond their limits. Projects abandoned when belief outpaced reality. All of it remains, not as myth, not as legend, as evidence. Evidence that long before machines, long before equations, long before modern science, humans learned how to organize themselves on an unprecedented scale. They learned how to coordinate labor, how to manage resources, how to turn knowledge into structure. They learned how to bend nature without breaking it. At least for a time, that was their true achievement. Not monuments, not cities, systems. Systems that could outlast individuals. Systems that could shape generations. And systems that, once rigid, could no longer evolve fast enough. Every civilization since has inherited this lesson. Every empire has repeated the experiment in its own way. Different materials, different technologies, the same questions. How much control is enough? How much structure becomes constraint? How long can balance be maintained? The first engineers who stood by the river did not seek immortality. They sought survival. It was later generations who chased eternity. And eternity does not belong to humans. It belongs to time. What remains today is not a warning carved in stone. It is an invitation to understand, to see that progress is not a straight line, that mastery is never permanent, that adaptation matters more than scale. The river taught them that lesson first. The stone recorded it, and history has been repeating it ever since. Long after the last great projects ended, long after the final rulers lost the ability to command entire landscapes, people continued to live among the remnants of a system they no longer fully understood. They repaired what they could. They reused what remained. They adapted old structures to new purposes. Canals became boundaries. Foundations became platforms. Monuments became reference points in a changing world. What had once been instruments of control slowly transformed into silent teachers. Every stone placed with intention carried information. Every alignment revealed planning. Every surviving structure hinted at methods refined through generations of trial and error. Time stripped away the authority, but it could not erase the intelligence. Later societies walked these landscapes without realizing they were reading a manual written in stone. They learned how much weight could be supported, how distance could be measured without tools, how labor could be synchronized, without machines. Even in decay, the system continued to educate. This is how true influence works, not through domination, not through conquest, but through persistence. The civilization that once mastered the river did not disappear into legend. It dissolved into continuity. Its ideas were absorbed, repurposed, and passed forward. What began as survival engineering became a universal language of power. Centuries later, other societies would face similar challenges: unpredictable environments, growing populations, limited resources. They would reach for the same solutions: organization, infrastructure, centralization, sometimes consciously, sometimes instinctively. And each time they would rediscover the same balance, that control creates stability. Stability enables growth. Growth demands structure. But structure, when pushed too far, resists change. The early builders understood flexibility because they lived inside uncertainty. They adjusted constantly. They observed continuously. Later generations inherited finished systems, not the mindset that created them. They maintained procedures without questioning assumptions. And that distinction mattered, because the world never stops changing. Rivers shift, climates evolve, resources fluctuate. Systems designed for one set of conditions must evolve or fail. Stone cannot adapt. Only people can. The tragedy was not that these systems collapsed, it was that they could not change fast enough. The success of the past became the constraint of the future. This pattern is not ancient. It is ongoing. Modern society still builds systems that feel permanent, infrastructure that assumes stability, institutions designed around predictability. And like the first great builders, we often mistake durability for permanence. We forget that the most powerful systems are not the strongest. They are the most adaptable. The lesson carved into the landscape thousands of years ago remains relevant. Control is never absolute. Order is never final. Balance must be maintained, not assumed. The people who first redirected the river did not seek domination. They sought survival. They accepted uncertainty. They learned through failure. They adjusted relentlessly. Their greatest achievement was not what they built. It was how they learned. When that learning stopped, decline became inevitable. And yet, even in decline, their impact endured. Because knowledge, once discovered, cannot be undiscovered. It can be forgotten. It can be ignored. But it waits. In stone, in structure, in the silent logic of what remains. That is why these landscapes still matter. They are not relics of a lost world. They are mirrors. They reflect what humans are capable of when necessity forces innovation. And they warn what happens when success replaces curiosity. The river still flows. It always will. It has seen empires rise and fall. It has outlasted kings, dynasties, and systems. And it continues to remind us of a simple truth. Nature does not negotiate. It responds. Those who listen can adapt. Those who assume control will eventually be corrected. The first engineers learned this lesson slowly, painfully, and permanently. They wrote it into the land. And thousands of years later, we are still reading it. People remembered the monuments, but not the mindset that created them. They admired the scale, but forgot the uncertainty. They inherited results, not the struggle. And that distinction changed everything. The earliest builders lived inside risk. They questioned constantly. They adjusted instinctively. Their world demanded awareness. Later generations lived inside systems designed to eliminate uncertainty. Predictability replaced observation. Routine replaced curiosity. When systems work too well, they teach people to stop paying attention. This is the quiet danger of success. The more reliable the structure, the less visible its assumptions become. And assumptions are fragile. The river did not change suddenly. It shifted gradually. Water levels varied. Sediment accumulated. Channels that once flowed freely narrowed. Small changes compounded over time. Maintenance schedules slipped. Repairs were delayed. Decisions favoured tradition over adaptation. The system continued to function, but only because it was overbuilt. Its strength masked its vulnerability. Eventually, the cost of preserving the old order exceeded the benefit it provided. Resources drained faster than they could be replaced. Labour demands increased. Returns diminished. People adapted not by improving the system, but by working around it. Informal solutions replaced centralised ones. Local adjustments bypassed rigid directives. Authority weakened not through rebellion alone, but through irrelevance. When systems fail to respond, people stop depending on them. That is how power dissolves, not with collapse, but with disengagement. The monuments remained standing, but they no longer commanded obedience. They became symbols rather than instruments. Symbols of a time when coordination had achieved something extraordinary. Symbols of ambition that once aligned with necessity. Symbols of mastery that eventually forgot humility. And humility is essential when confronting forces larger than any system. The river did not need to conquer the civilization. It simply waited. It eroded foundations slowly. It shifted paths quietly. Nature is patient. Civilizations rarely are. This imbalance ensures that no system remains dominant forever. And yet, this is not a story of failure. It is a story of limits. The builders did not fail because they were careless. They failed because they reached the boundary of what was possible within their assumptions. They solved the problems they could see. They could not predict the ones that emerged from success itself. That paradox remains unresolved even today. Every solution creates new dependencies. Every system creates new constraints. The question is never whether control is achievable. It is whether adaptability can be preserved alongside it. The first engineers succeeded because they listened. They observed. They responded. Their descendants inherited answers, not questions. And without questions, systems stagnate. This is the quiet lesson embedded in the landscape. Not that humans should avoid building, but that they must remain learners. Not that control is dangerous, but that certainty is. The structures still stand because stone remembers effort. But effort alone does not guarantee survival. Only awareness does. The river continues to move, carrying with it fragments of the past, silt from ancient channels, sand from collapsed embankments, each grain a reminder that even the greatest systems return to the earth. And yet the knowledge persists, encoded in geometry, in proportion, in alignment, waiting for those willing to look beyond admiration and ask why things were built the way they were. That curiosity is the true inheritance, more valuable than monuments, more durable than stone, because it can adapt. The civilization that once reshaped a river did not vanish into silence. It became a reference point, a starting place, a demonstration of what humans can accomplish when necessity drives innovation and what they risk when innovation gives way to complacency. That balance remains unresolved. It always will. And as long as humans continue to build, to organize, to control, the lesson written into that ancient landscape will remain relevant, not as a warning, not as a celebration, but as a reminder. that the most powerful systems are not those that dominate nature. They are the ones that remain capable of changing with it.